when he brought up doing well, you doing good by doing well, you can do well, and how different it was just a few months later, after the first time he did it when he was met with like and then the second time there was real engagement in it. And we see something happening, something that Susan shared, something that Annika shared. Most of you have probably seen that in August, the Business Roundtable released a, what they call a statement redefining the purpose of a corporation, in which they say we have to move away from exclusively shareholder primacy to a broader spectrum of stakeholders. And at about the same time, Gillian Tett, the US managing editor of the Financial Times, wrote a piece called Capitalism, A New Dawn, addressing many of the same issues. And just recently, she and the FT have released a new series, which if you don't receive, I suggest you sign up for. It's called Moral Money. And it's the first time that the FT is dedicating itself to explaining to investors why they should pay attention to environmental, social, and governance, or what we call ESG principles. And so about this time, I had an exchange with Gillian, and I also had an exchange with Paul Pullman, who most of you know has recently stepped down as CEO of Unilever, and he's launched something called Imagine. And Imagine, his purpose, he says, is to help companies pursue the UN sustainability goals with a collective sense of urgency, especially to battle inequity and climate change. And I discussed with both of them why we believe that now we may finally be at a tipping point where corporations actually have to do something about corporate social responsibility, not just talk about it. And so IMD asked me to share very specific stories rather than my general involvement in the sphere for the last 5 decades. I come from the era of the Rachel Carlson Silent Springs 1960s, and actually Annika referred to the 1992 Rio Summit. I organized the NGO forum for that summit. So I've been at this for a long time. But since this particular segment that Susan and I are sharing is called Leadership, Responsibility, Action, and Hope, they really wanted me to share 2 stories of hope to show that it can be done, it has been done. Now obviously with 15 minutes I have to give very abbreviated versions of these stories. I'm happy to share more detail with you when we have our coffee breaks during the day. But I chose 2 stories, and the first one takes place in the 1970s. And the reason I chose it is because what we put in place then is still holding. And so it still has relevance today. And if you have interest about it, by the way, I did a TED Talk about it. It's called Adversaries to Allies. So in the 1970s, I helped 4 groups who at the time were literally the bitterest of enemies. Environmental activists, loggers, community organizers, and the government. You have to remember, in the 1970s, environmentalists were chaining themselves to trees. So this was not a time where renewable resource had not entered the common lexicon at this point. But I helped convene them to pull them together in what ultimately first became state legislation investing for prosperity, the first of renewable resources, and ultimately became global climate green plans, working with Wangari Maathai and other people around the world. And our initial work was on reforestation. And I had this aha moment that while it might be cathartic for the environmentalists to be chaining themselves to trees, they were not actually going to change the policies or procedures of the logging companies by doing so, unless they were willing to sit down with them. And they didn't have to just sit down with them, because there also had to be governmental support, legislation to support whatever kind of goals they were going to try to engage in. And so it was a process of convening 4 very disparate groups who initially came into a very wary coalition of like, okay, I'll sit in the same room for 2 minutes. But through a process of intensive dialogue over time, we actually came up with a solution. And I knew that unless these 4 sectors talked to each other, we were never going to find a solution. And this is true about every problem we face. No one sector on its own has the resources, the capacity, the knowledge base, the motivation to solve any of these huge global problems we face. But together, we actually collectively do have the knowledge, the wisdom, the strength, the ability. So I knew that it was absolutely critical to convene them. And what we ended up with was a change of policy and procedure where that the logging industry had to, up until that point they had been strip logging, which was a very common practice. And they had to, for every tree they cut down, they had to replant 2. And after we dealt with reforestation, we dealt with forestries, we dealt with all of the renewable resources. And the legislation that we put in place in the state of California not only survives today and has survived like changing Democratic and Republican administrations, but it has strengthened. And as I say, it has become a model for global green plans. So the second story, which also involves a coalition of the, not so willing initially. In 2000, global AIDS activists were protesting at all the gatherings, gatherings like in Barcelona, and they were holding signs, Coke kills workers in Africa. And ironically, Coca-Cola actually had the best practices and policies and procedures for testing and treatment of their employees, of any employer on the continent of Africa. But the activists were saying, but you need to be providing the same services for your bottling affiliates. And Coca-Cola was saying, well, the bottling affiliates are separate entities. They're not part of our bottom line, so they're not part of our responsibility. And they were really at this impasse. And Coca-Cola came to me saying, we have a PR problem. And I said to them, okay, if you think what you have is a PR problem, go somewhere else. I'm not your gal. But if you actually want to do the work of having dialogue with these people who are protesting against you, I'm all in. And again, we began a very intensive dialogue process. Not easy at the beginning, not easy to bring people who have absolutely conflicting ideas together. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking just at this moment, if you think of the incredibly divisive world we're living in right now, if there was ever a need to bring people with really different perspectives together and have civil dialogue to find solutions, now more than ever, we need this to happen. And in the course of the dialogue, Coca-Cola began to realize that it was actually in their own enlightened self-interest to be serving their bottling affiliates. Why? Because if they became infected, especially the drivers, it negatively affected their entire supply chain. And secondly, they realized the public did not distinguish between Coca-Cola, the drink, and Coca-Cola, the bottling affiliates, and so it was damaging their brand. And so, you know, honestly, I have to say, even if they only came into it because they were concerned about their brand, the fact that they were willing to make changes, I don't care what the initial motivation, I will find people, whatever their initial motivation, and find a way to bring them into dialogue with a cross-sectoral dialogue that will really help create success. And in the end, they co-developed with the bottling affiliates a formula where Coca-Cola, the company, would pay some portion of the cost, the bottling affiliates would pay some portion of the cost, and at my insistence, even the employees had to pay some portion of the cost. It was super nominal, but I've also experienced that when you're a stakeholder, if you don't put any skin in the game, you're not really a stakeholder. Only people who really put a skin in the game. This is why even when I do consulting work in, like, you know, tiny little NGOs outside of Maputo, Mozambique, I insist that they pay something. Of course, it's a completely sliding scale than when I have Coca-Cola as my client, but I've really learned you have to put in to get out. And with this formula, which they first rolled out in 7 African nations where they had the most stable structure, and ultimately they rolled it out to all of the countries on the continent of Africa. And honestly, Coca-Cola is the single largest employer on the continent. So having worked with like lots of HIV/AIDS organizations and being really proud of that, like changing the practices and policies of Coca-Cola, you know, the turtle guy said I could go to sleep with a smile on my face. I could go to sleep with a smile on my face, you know, knowing that one thing. So from these kind of fairly difficult negotiations that involved a lot of complexity, I distilled kind of 4 essential lessons for me. The starting point is that everybody who's involved has to be absolutely honest and clear about what they are willing to put into the collaboration and what they anticipate and desire to get out of the collaboration. Now, that sounds ridiculously obvious, but I can't even begin to tell you the number of partnerships, collaborations that fail simply because people do not, at the jump start, make it clear to each other and even to themselves what their expectations in both directions are. And then there's a failure of expectations because the expectations have not been explicitly conveyed. The second point is that once you've made those clear of what the expectations are, you have to find and mobilize those who can see a larger position, a larger picture than their own territorial positions. We all know the difference between the type of person who's willing to operate across lines, operate between regions, and the person who feels like I get all my power by holding all the information to myself and never sharing it with anyone, and my contacts are my contacts. I always try to say to people, listen, if it's a thing, if I take this pen and throw it over to Susan, Susan now has the pen, I no longer have a pen. It's a thing. It's a finite thing. She has it, I don't have it. But if I share with Susan or with any one of you all of my ideas, all of my contacts, I said, oh, you should be in touch with so-and-so, and I give you their name and email, blah, 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 blah. I'm not diminished at all. I still have those ideas. I still have those contacts. Now you have them. Now, and the problems of the world are so big, we can't afford that kind of gatekeeper mentality. No, you can only talk to the people I know if you talk to me, and I'll be in touch with you, and then I'll let you know. It's crazy. Let go of these territorial positions, whether it's within internal stakeholders, as I say, it can be the cubicle next to you where sometimes people are not sharing information, or with your willing external stakeholders like your suppliers and your clients, and even, as the first case showed, with adversarial stakeholders, with NGO watchdog groups, with government regulatory agencies, and or if you're the NGO with the enterprise that's polluting or doing whatever other thing is the raison d'etre for your NGO. It is possible, but the third idea is that engagement is never a one-shot deal. It's not like I meet you, I say, hi Ian, great to, let's work together. And we agree, and we say, yeah, we're gonna work together. We may never talk to each other again, unless we each pursue it. It requires ongoing nurturing. I have to stay in touch with you. You have to stay in touch with me. If it's a larger group, we have to stay in touch with each other. I hope that all of you will stay in touch with each other after this amazing experience and have the opportunity to learn from each other. Because there were moments in both of those cases that I shared where at least one stakeholder, if not all of them, really just wanted to walk away from the table and go, forget it. But they hung in. They hung in despite that, frustration, and they were able to collectively overcome the obstacles. I want to make it clear, it's not that there aren't obstacles. Neither of these stories, I told them very briefly and I told them very simply. It sounds like it just happened. They're very complex. It involves a real commitment. It involves a lot of intellectual, psychic, emotional input over sustained long periods of time. And whenever, this is a very important part of engagement, when there's a breakdown, because inevitably there will be breakdowns, inevitably there will be misunderstandings. When there's a breakdown, you have to honestly step forward and own it and say, we've had a rupture of our trust. We need to do something to regain that trust. Because when you don't, if you try to gloss over it, you never really, kind of people are holding back. So it's only when you recreate those bonds over and over and over, and it's an iterative process, and restore the connections, and I'm all about connectedness and staying connected, that you re-clarify, only if we work together can we achieve why we came into this in the first place. And the fourth point is about humanity. And what I said earlier about now in this divided world, essentially, as human beings, while we come from different countries, different cultures, different regions, different sectors, we have different perspectives, different ideologies, different religions. At core, most human beings share the very same incredibly simple, grounded concerns. We all want our families to be happy and healthy, and we all want our communities, our nations, and our world to be safe. I mean, plain and simple. We just want to be happy, secure, safe, healthy. You can't find a human being on earth who doesn't want that. And so when you sustain dialogue, however difficult, however long, if you somehow can find a way to really acknowledge the humanity in another person who may be completely different than you, and you may not agree with them ideologically, but if you can somehow find, honestly, to be able to find the humanity in another human being, first requires finding your own humanity, coming from a very grounded place of saying, I'm a human being. And the South African concept of Ubuntu is I am a human being through my relationships with other human beings. It's very much like the Martin Buber I-thou concept. We are human through our connection. So when you ground and connect to your own humanity, it allows you to see the humanity in the other human being, even if you disagree. And in that space, you can create magic. So if you want to contribute at whatever level, in whatever way, to protect the future of the planet and inspire what could be, while they may seem deceptively simple, they are very difficult to do. Be honest and clear. Go beyond territorial positions. Offer ongoing nurturing. Reveal your humanity and find humanity in the others. Thank you.